Hello, and welcome back to Sonata She Wrote. This is part 2 of an analysis of Mozart's 17th Piano Concerto. If you haven't seen the first video, in which I discussed the exposition writ large, which includes the first ritornello and solo section, I would check that out before watching this video. Unless you really like being confused, in which case, keep going. Today we are discussing the remainder of the first movement of this concerto, which will begin with Ritornello 2. R2 functions as a kind of closing zone for the entire first two rotations, before we get to the development. As you can see in this chart from the Sonata Theory Handbook, Ritornello 2 is typically a fragmented rotation. But the function of an R2 rotation is to reattach any closing modules which the solo rotation may not have sounded, in an effort to give a sense of completeness. This R2, however, jumps right from the trill cadence in a raucous delivery of the original Ritornello 1 transition material. Hepokoski and Darcy do note in the Elements of Sonata Theory that opening Ritornello 2 with transition is a standard practice for Mozart, but where it gets dicey is in bar 176, we have the cadential material of Ritornello 1's EEC moment. The question we have to answer is whether this counts as secondary theme material. If we decide that it does, this essential closure in R2 would not necessarily erase Solo 1's EEC, but it would take pride of place as the structural cadence, while the Solo 1's EEC would become secondary. In my opinion, because we don't actually get any of Ritornello 1's secondary theme, this does not count as an EEC, especially because the cadence is followed by actual S material. Now, the secondary theme material in question has the soloist in it, but because it doesn't begin solo, I'm labeling this as an R2 S2 merger. After the R2-S2 merger, we're solidly in the development when we reach this display episode. Hepokoski and Darcy point out that while a Type 5 development might have much in common with other sonata types, including the focus on minor 3, which we have here, they may also be more episodic and less obviously rotational. After this brief display episode, it took me quite a while to track down where Mozart plucked this little motive from, and I believe it's based around this measure of Solo 1's unique secondary theme. Ritornello 3 opens the recapitulation. You may have noticed in the chart already, but Ritornello 3 is probably the most nebulous of any of the sections of the concerto. Sometimes it may be omitted, sometimes it may be merged with Solo 3, and it may or may not open the recapitulation. This Ritornello 3 contains only the primary theme and the transition before Solo 3 enters. But will Solo 3 enter with its own secondary theme? Or will it submit to the ritornello sections and sound their secondary theme? You may have noticed I wrote here there was potentially an R3-S3 merger. Although that's certainly what I might think if I was only hearing this piece, I'm not sure we can really say that's what's happening. In terms of the narrative, I like the idea of Mozart joining the piano with the orchestra specifically to reach a perfect authentic cadence together before the transition. In fact, you may notice at the end of this transition, we have the medial caesura and the caesura fill material of ritornello 1. Even the piano joins in with the caesura fill. Is our pianist ready to cooperate? Although not Ritornello 1's P theme, Mozart's choice to push Solo 1's secondary theme up a fourth rather than down a fifth isn't without meaning. Generally, sonata forms tend not only toward cadences, but also toward the center of the staff, at that cadence. By presenting the theme in this high voice, especially on the forte piano it would have been played on at the time, Mozart is considerably weakening the theme. From there, we move on to Solo 1's transition, but again, hear Ritornello 1's medial caesura and caesura fill. The ultimate question is, where will we hear the essential structural closure? Will it be in the corresponding location of Solo 1, or will some of Ritornello 1's secondary theme wipe it away and require a new option? the correspondence section of Solo 3, we do have a PAC in G major. The reason I haven't marked this as ESC is twofold. First, you may notice that after S3's closing display episode, which also includes more PACs, Ritornello 4.1 reintroduces the original R1 S1.2. Remember, if a ritornello reintroduces secondary theme material after a PAC by the solo rotation, then that previous cadence is now secondary. The second reason for this is that Type 5 sonata forms come built in with another ESC option. If the ESC of Solo 3 is somehow mitigated by Ritornello 4, which in our case it has been, we know that the soloist can reach a structural cadence at the end of their cadenza. The cadenza is a semi-improvisatory section in which the soloist, after the orchestra opens up the first half of a cadential 6/4 chord, will generally cycle through the themes of the concerto, and finally, nearly always after a large trill, will cadence and complete the other side of the cadential 6/4. In the case of this concerto, I believe this is where the essential structural closure is. The cadenza in this performance was actually written by Mozart for either ployers or his own use. What strikes me most about this cadenza is it includes two attempts at a trill cadence, one successful and one unsuccessful. The pianist tries, for the final time, to cadence using the material of their own S. Solo 1, secondary theme 1. This repetitive horn-like call before giving up the ghost and finally letting it go. After the essential structural closure that ends the cadenza, the second part of R4, labeled R4.2, closes out the movement with the original R1 closing modules. Hepokoski and Darcy have given this type of sonata the designation of Type 5 and marked it as the most complicated simply because there are so many discursive options for each of the 7 parts of this form, up to and including omitting or blurring the lines between them. Also, this form is based almost entirely on Mozart's own use of this form, which was later expanded by Beethoven, which means there are vanishingly few examples of the form to base this on. Following the classical period, concertos began to more often be in a Type 3 sonata form, or, in the case of someone like Brahms, written as a Type 5 for a deliberate pastiche effect. Having said that, K453 is one of the more textbook versions of this highly complex form, so I hoped this has helped to provide a little clarity. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and if you are really enjoying yourself, consider joining my Patreon.